History is peppered with stunning examples of women ascending to the pinnacle of power, their actions reshaping the very fabric of the world. We're not talking about fairy tale princesses or the glitter of jewels on a crown. Forget the tired old cliché of a man's world. That's just stating the obvious. Our mission is to delve into the lives of those who, armed with strategic minds, visionary foresight, and an extraordinary talent for intrigue, managed to seize the reins of power where they were least expected, forever etching their names into history. This narrative will weave together figures known to all, such as Catherine the Great and Victoria, with those whose daring and sometimes genius moves are talked about far less often. Prepare for unexpected twists that will challenge your perception of the past. Let's kick things off with Catherine II. Catherine, born on April 21st, 1729 in Stettin, came from a modest German princely family. She was christened Sophie August Friederike von Anhalt-Zerbst. She arrived in the Russian capital in 1744, a 15-year-old girl, to become the bride of the heir to the throne, Peter Fyodorovich. Unlike her future husband, a weak-willed and childishly immature man whose heart belonged more to Prussia than to Russia, Catherine understood from the start that complete assimilation into the Russian court was a matter of life or death. This understanding became the cornerstone of her future triumph. She meticulously studied the Russian language, sincerely embraced Orthodox Christianity, and renouncing her former name, became Catherine Alexeyevna. Her true game for the throne began in 1762. By that point, Peter III, who had ascended to the throne after the death of Elizabeth Petrovna on December 25, 1761, had reigned for a mere 6 months, from January to June 1762. In this short period, he managed to alienate almost every segment of society. The Guards were outraged by the abolition of privileges and the introduction of Prussian orders. The nobility feared the confiscation of lands, and the clergy were indignant at his open sympathies for Protestantism. While the emperor indulged in empty military parades in his chambers, his wife methodically prepared a coup d'état. Catherine understood perfectly that the key to power in Russia was the Guards, and she began systematically winning their trust, personally communicating with officers, listening attentively to their complaints, and promising long-awaited changes. The culmination came on June 28, 1762. On this day, dressed in the uniform of the Preobrazhensky Regiment and with a saber at her side, Catherine appeared before the jubilant crowd in Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg. The Preobrazhensky, Semyonovsky, and Izmailovsky Guards regiments swore allegiance to her as the new empress. At that very moment, Peter III, unaware of the impending catastrophe, was in Oranienbaum, located about 25 miles from the capital. His arrest took place on June 29th, and on July 6th, he died in very mysterious circumstances. The official cause was listed as hemorrhoidal colic, but persistent rumors stubbornly insisted on strangulation. Catherine masterfully avoided direct evidence of her involvement, but her amazing composure in this situation spoke louder than any words. The newly minted Empress's first decree, issued on July 8, 1762, was deceptively simple, yet utterly brilliant. The Guards were ordered to receive free vodka. She understood perfectly well that the soldiers who had just overthrown the legitimate monarch needed to feel an immediate and tangible reward for their loyalty. This tactical move instantly solidified her position on the throne. While the Guards celebrated the new ruler, the nobles and commoners saw in her a strong, decisive leader. Thus began her triumphant reign, lasting a full 34 years, until November 17th, 1796, the day of her death. Catherine's rule was dictated by strict calculation. In 1764, she carried out a large-scale secularization of church lands, transferring them to the state treasury, which brought in millions of rubles to replenish the army and finance urgent reforms. In 1768, the First Russo-Turkish War broke out, ending in 1774 with the signing of the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kainaka. Thanks to it, Russia gained much-needed access to the Black Sea and control over Crimea, which in 1783 was officially incorporated into the empire. Her army, led by such outstanding commanders as Suvorov and Rumyantsev, crushed enemies on land, and the fleet under the command of Orlov won a brilliant victory at the Battle of Chesma in 1770. However, Catherine was not limited to military triumphs alone. She worked extremely diligently on her own image. From 1764, she maintained an extensive correspondence with Voltaire, a prominent French Enlightenment philosopher. This subtle diplomatic game was conducted in secret, with letters delivered through trusted individuals in order to create the image of an enlightened sovereign in Europe. She skillfully wrote about her reforms, about the laws, about the greatness of the Russian Empire. Voltaire, in turn, called her the Semiramis of the North, and tirelessly praised her in Parisian salons. Catherine perceived this as a powerful tool of influence. While her reputation shone abroad, she steadily strengthened her absolute power within the country. In 1767, she convened the Legislative Commission, an assembly whose purpose was to discuss new legislative acts. Although the commission did not produce concrete results, it successfully demonstrated to the world the image of a monarch willing to listen to the voice of her people. And yet, her reign was not without its clouds. From 1773 to 1775, a major rebellion broke out under the leadership of Yemelyan Pugachev. Peasants and Cossacks rose up against serfdom, but Catherine mercilessly suppressed this rebellion by force. Pugachev was executed in 1775. Nevertheless, even this tragic chapter of history, the Empress managed to turn to her advantage, significantly strengthening control over the regions. Catherine died at the age of 67, leaving Russia far more powerful than it had been before her. After her departure, the throne was taken by her son Paul I, but the true flourishing of the empire is inextricably linked with her era, covering the period from 1762 to 1796. Catherine the Great clearly showed the world how a woman can not only seize power, but also turn chaos into unprecedented strength. Now our journey takes us north in Europe, to the depths of the 14th century, where another outstanding woman, Margaret I of Denmark, accomplished something that seemed utterly unthinkable. She managed to unite three kingdoms, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, into the mighty Kalmar Union without ever placing a crown on her own head. She didn't just rule on behalf of others. Margaret created a complex system where her unyielding will proved stronger than any titles or formal rights. Her life is not a dry paragraph from a textbook, but a true saga of survival, sophisticated cunning, and an unyielding thirst for power, seasoned with a light, barely perceptible mockery of those who dared to underestimate her. The title, King in a Skirt, was not mere wit, but a reflection of her true essence. Margaret not only conducted complex negotiations with powerful barons, but also personally commanded armies and dictated laws with such unwavering confidence that her actions were invariably compared to the exploits of great male warriors. Legend has it that once, when one of her advisors carelessly hinted at the impossibility of a woman ruling three kingdoms, she replied with a barely noticeable sly smile, "My skirt is my best armor, for in it I can conceal far more than you can in your shining plate." This phrase instantly became a symbol of her unique style of government, outward softness, concealed and unbending inner steel. Let's consider one of many examples demonstrating her exceptional cunning and foresight. In the 1390s, powerful German merchants, united in the Hanseatic League and effectively controlling all trade in the Baltic, decided to put pressure on Margaret. They issued an ultimatum demanding extensive benefits and threatening a complete blockade of Danish ports. Instead of engaging in open confrontation, Margaret chose a much more subtle and clever approach. Dressed in the modest clothes of a simple merchant and covering her head with a scarf, She, unrecognized, appeared at a meeting with representatives of the Hanseatic League, posing as an uninterested mediator. While the arrogant merchants hotly debated and shared their plans with this simple woman, Margaret listened attentively to their strategy. They intended to significantly increase duties and completely block grain supplies. She merely nodded silently, assimilating every word. Later, returning to her palace, she brilliantly used the information she had obtained. Margaret immediately strengthened her seaports, concluded secret trade agreements with other, less aggressive merchants, and thus was able to completely bypass the Hanseatic League, retaining control over all trade in the Baltic. The haughty Hanseatic merchants never found out who had really outplayed them. It was a genuine historical paradox. A woman who technically held no royal title and wore no crown managed to forge an empire that powerful kings had dreamed of for centuries. Margaret I of Denmark didn't just unite Denmark, Norway and Sweden. She proved that true power stems not from formal titles, but from a sharp intellect, unwavering will, and a unique ability to see far beyond the horizon. Her Kalmar Union marked an important initial stride toward a unified Scandinavia, and her name still echoes in history as a brilliant symbol of female strength cloaked in a skirt. Now, we journey southward to the dazzling Ottoman Empire of the 16th century, where Hürrem Sultan graces the historical stage. Her life's journey began in the chains of slavery, yet concluded at the helm of one of the greatest global powers of her time. Forget the cliché of a seductive concubine draped in flowing silks. We're presented with a masterful diplomat, a cunning spy, and a cold-blooded strategist whose indomitable will reshaped the very destiny of the empire during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent. Hürrem was born at the dawn of the 16th century. The exact date of her birth remains shrouded in the mists of time, though most historians lean toward 1502 or 1504. Her birthplace was within the lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, allegedly in the small town of Rohatin, nestled in what is now western Ukraine. Back then, she was known as Alexandra, or Anastasia Lisovska, the daughter of a humble Orthodox priest. The future Sultana's childhood unfolded among simple wooden houses and boundless fields, until, around the age of 15, circa 1517 or 1518, her life was brutally shattered by a Crimean Tatar raid. Captured and enslaved, she was sold in the slave markets of Crimea, from whence her path led to Istanbul, the majestic capital of the Ottoman Empire. It was there, in one of the bustling slave markets, that her striking appearance caught the eye of agents from Topkapi Palace, the primary residence of the Ottoman sultans. Hürrem was purchased for the harem of Shehzada Suleiman, who would later become the Great Sultan. In 1520, when Suleiman I ascended the throne following the death of his father, Selim I, on September 22nd, Hürrem already held a place among his numerous concubines. The Topkapi harem was hardly the stuff of fairy tales. It was more like an arena for ruthless survival. Hundreds of women, from refined Persians to fiery Georgians, desperately vied for the Sultan's attention, and the sole path to influence lay through bearing male heirs and the fickle favor of fate. Hürrem entered this world of intrigue empty-handed, save for her remarkably sharp mind. Her unusual red hair and fair skin, uncommon in the Ottoman court, drew attention, yet her true power lay elsewhere. In 1521, she gave birth to her firstborn, a son named Mehmed, marking the initial step toward her future greatness. In the years that followed, she bore Suleiman 5 more children. However, Hürrem had no intention of being confined to the role of mother to the heirs. In 1530, an event occurred that shattered centuries of Ottoman tradition. Suleiman married Hürrem, making her his legal wife. This was unprecedented, as Ottoman sultans very rarely took former concubines as wives. From then on, she was known as Hürrem Sultan, which translates to the cheerful sultana. Yet, behind her seemingly light-hearted smile lay an unwavering iron resolve. How did she become the de facto ruler of the empire? Her primary tool of influence became letters. Suleiman, known in Europe as the Magnificent, and within his empire as Kanuni, meaning the lawgiver, spent long years on military campaigns. In 1521, he seized Belgrade. In 1522, Rhodes. In 1526, he crushed the Hungarians at the Battle of Mohacs, and in 1534, he captured Baghdad. While the Sultan waged war, Hürrem remained in Istanbul, managing the palace and holding all the reins of power in her clutches. Her letters to Suleiman were not mere tender messages from a loving wife. They were finely tuned, strategically crucial reports. She wrote about the moods at court, the secret schemes of the viziers, any and all rumors circulating in the harem. In 1534, while Suleiman was on a military campaign in Persia, Hürrem subtly hinted in one of her letters at the excessive accumulation of power by the Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, who was a longtime friend of the Sultan. She made no direct accusations, but skillfully planted seeds of doubt, cautiously pointing out that Ibrahim was taking on too much. Soon after, on the night of March 15th to 16th, 1536, Ibrahim was found strangled in his chambers. Officially, this occurred at the Sultan's command, but it was Hürrem's letter that served as the first decisive push toward his downfall. She was not merely a concubine, but a veritable spy within the innermost walls of the palace. The harem was always a seething cauldron of intrigue. Suleiman's mother, Valide Hafsa Sultan, and his first concubine, Mahidevran Sultan, the mother of the eldest Shehzade Mustafa, initially saw Hürrem as an implacable rival. In 1526, Mahidevran even physically assaulted her, leaving scratches on her face, but Hürrem managed to turn this to her advantage, portraying herself to Suleiman as an innocent victim. When Hafsa Sultan passed away in March of 1534, Hürrem gained complete freedom of action. In 1536, she persuaded Suleiman to send Mahidevran, along with Mustafa, to the distant province of Manisa, far from the intrigues of the capital. Her vast network of informants, including eunuchs, maids, and even merchants from the bazaar, reported absolutely everything to her, who whispered in the corridors, who met behind the palace walls. In the 1540s, when Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest and most popular son, matured into an outstanding military commander and a potential threat to her own sons, Hürrem launched a methodical campaign. Through her letters, she insinuated to Suleiman that Mustafa was allegedly plotting against him. In 1553, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his military camp in Ereğli and ordered his execution by strangulation with a silk cord. Hürrem was not physically present at this tragedy, but her invisible shadow loomed over the execution site, determining its outcome. Hürrem Sultan passed away on April 15, 1558, in Istanbul, presumably from a prolonged illness, perhaps a fever or cancer. She was about 55 years old. Suleiman outlived her by 8 years, passing away on September 7, 1566, during a campaign in Hungary. Her story is not only a tale of an incredible ascent from the abyss of slavery to the heights of power, but also a vivid testament to how influence, skillfully wielded from the shadows, can rewrite the fate of a great empire. After their son, Selim II, ascended to the Sultan's throne in 1566, his reign was marred by weakness, earning him the nickname Selim the Sot. However, his mother, Hürrem, left behind a far more substantial legacy, imprinted not only in her descendants, but also in monumental stone structures. For instance, the Haseki Mosque, erected under her personal supervision between 1538 and 1541, designed by the great architect Sinan, was an unprecedented event in the history of the Ottoman Empire. For the first time, such a grand religious edifice was commissioned and financed by a woman. Her extensive charitable activities, which included the establishment of hospitals, educational institutions, and water supply systems such as public fountains, significantly strengthened her image in the public's memory, portraying her as a caring and wise patron. Hürrem Sultan was a figure far more complex and multifaceted than merely a cheerful resident of the Sultan's chambers or a captivating beauty of the harem. She possessed strategic thinking. Her messages and advice influenced the Sultan's most critical decisions. She acted as a skilled intelligence operative whose sprawling network of informants encompassed the entire palace, and as a far-sighted diplomat whose subtle moves determined the fates of nations. From a humble slave, once sold in a slave market, she managed to rise to the position of an unofficial ruler, becoming the shadow behind the throne of Suleiman the Magnificent. Through her life, she convincingly proved that true power lies not only in the strength of a blade or military might, but also in the power of a word, spoken at the proper moment and in the right place. Now, let us transport ourselves to the Iberian Peninsula, to Spain in the late 15th century, where Isabella of Castile reigned. This queen wasn't afraid to take risks, investing in the boldest ventures and resolutely waging wars, thereby radically changing the fate not only of her country, but of the entire world. Isabella first saw the light of day on April 22nd, 1451, in the small town of Madrigal de las Altas Torres. She was born into a royal family. Her father was John II, King of Castile, and her mother was his second wife, Isabella of Portugal. She was the third child, having an older brother, Henry, and a sister whose life was cut short in infancy. Her father was a weak ruler, far more interested in hunting and lavish feasts than the complexities of governance. Her mother, conversely, often suffered from bouts of deep melancholy. When King John II passed away in 1474, Isabella was just 3 years old. The crown of Castile went to her half-brother, Henry IV, the king's son from his first marriage. Isabella, along with her mother and younger brother Alfonso, who was born in 1473, were sent away from the palace intrigues to Arevalo Castle. There, amidst the stark stone walls and on the barren lands, Isabella spent her childhood, immersing herself in books, diligently studying Latin, and listening intently to tales of Castile's former glory. Yet, her childhood was anything but carefree. Henry, nicknamed the Impotent due to his political indecisiveness and widespread rumors about his infertility, ruled the country quite ineffectively. Power was essentially divided among feuding noble families, and the kingdom was steadily approaching complete collapse. In 1482, when Isabella turned 11, she was summoned to court in Segovia. Henry aimed to keep her under constant watch. While at court, she witnessed the king generously bestowing vast land holdings upon his favorites. Meanwhile, his wife, Joanna of Portugal, gave birth to a daughter, also named Joanna, but whose paternity was openly questioned, as she was popularly known as the daughter of Beltran, the queen's lover. In 1485, a faction of Castilian nobles revolted, formally deposing Henry and proclaiming the 12-year-old Alfonso as king. Isabella, however, chose to remain aloof from this direct conflict. But in 1488, Alfonso suddenly passed away under very mysterious circumstances. Rumors circulated of plague or even poison. She was 17, and now she was next in line for the throne. The highest nobility offered her the crown, but Isabella wisely declined, realizing that an open confrontation with Henry would inevitably weaken her position. Instead, in 1489, she reached an agreement with him at Guisando. Under the terms of the agreement, Henry recognized her as his rightful heir, but reserved the right to choose her future husband. King Henry himself wished to marry her off to the Portuguese monarch or a French prince. But Isabella already harbored her own bold plans. In October of 1489, she managed to secretly leave her residence, which was under her brother's surveillance, and made her way to Valladolid, where she secretly wed Ferdinand of Aragon, son of King John II of Aragon. She was 18 years old and he was 17. This marriage was her first truly big gamble. The newlyweds had neither funds nor an army of their own, and Henry, in turn, immediately declared Isabella a traitor, stripping her of her title as heir in favor of Joanna. However, Isabella saw in Ferdinand not just a husband, but the key to the future unification of Spain. She realized that Castile and Aragon, united, could become a single mighty force. In 1494, Henry died, leaving behind a contested throne. Isabella, not wasting a moment, declared herself queen in Segovia on December 13th of that same year. Her supporters immediately raised their banners. However, Joanna, who had the backing of Portugal and a segment of the Castilian nobility, launched a full-scale war for the throne. This bloody civil war lasted a full 5 years, from 1474 to 1479. Isabella and Ferdinand won a decisive victory at the Battle of Toro in 1476. In 1479, Portugal, realizing the futility of further resistance, retreated, signing the Treaty of Alcachovas. Isabella finally established herself as the rightful queen of Castile. Ferdinand inherited Aragon that same year after the passing of his father. Their marital and political union laid the unshakable foundation for the future united Spain. Her reign was marked by a series of extraordinary and momentous decisions. The first of these was a decisive bet on Christopher Columbus. In 1486, this Genoese first appeared before the Spanish court with a seemingly insane plan: to reach India by sailing west across the vast ocean. At that time, the Portuguese were already actively exploring the sea route around Africa, and most scholars scoffed at Columbus, arguing that the earth was too large for such an undertaking. Isabella and Ferdinand initially refused him, as the royal treasury was depleted by previous wars. However, in 1491, Columbus returned, and Isabella, after lengthy and heated debates with her advisors, made a truly fateful decision. On April 17, 1492, she signed the agreement in Santa Fe, providing Columbus with 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina, as well as modest funding. This was a colossal risk. If Columbus failed, the Queen could lose not only valuable resources, but also her authority in the eyes of all of Europe. However, if his assumptions proved correct, Spain could outpace Portugal in the race for global dominance. On August 3, 1492, Columbus sailed from the port of Palos de la Frontera. On October 12th, he returned, announcing the discovery of India, though it was actually America. Isabella immediately launched a powerful public relations campaign. She was proclaimed the patron of the new lands, and the gold and riches that flowed from the Caribbean islands began to rapidly fill the treasury. In 1493, she sent Columbus on a second expedition, definitively securing Spain's status as a leading naval power. The second key decision was the Reconquista. In 1480, Castile and Aragon waged a protracted and exhausting war against the Emirate of Granada, the last Muslim state remaining on the Iberian Peninsula. The beginning of this epical battle foreshadowed not merely a change of power on the peninsula, but a profound transformation of the cultural, religious, and political landscape, whose echoes would be felt for many centuries to come. Isabella and Ferdinand made the momentous decision to end the centuries-old struggle for the Iberian Peninsula. In 1481, they officially declared war on Emir Mohammed XII, better known as Boabdil. Isabella did not remain aloof from this struggle, actively participating in the military campaigns. She personally accompanied the army, organized the supply of food and equipment, and inspired the soldiers with her presence. In 1491, her troops began the siege of Granada, which was the key city of the emirate. The Queen set up her camp in Santa Fe, just 10 kilometers from the impregnable fortress. On November 26, 1491, a fire broke out in her tent, caused by a fallen candle. The fire rapidly engulfed the entire camp, but Isabella did not panic and flee. Instead, she donned her armor, breastplate, helmet and chainmail skirt, and remained by her warrior's side until the fire was extinguished. Her incredible resilience immediately became legendary, and soldiers whispered among themselves, calling her the Iron Queen. On January 2nd, 1492, Boabdil was forced to capitulate, handing over the keys to Granada to the victors. Isabella and Ferdinand entered the magnificent Alhambra on white horses, and this event became not just a triumph, but a brilliant public relations move by the Queen. A united Spain became her trademark, and the banner with the cross transformed into a powerful symbol of a new era. The third distinguishing trait of Isabella was her personal presence. She was not a queen who remained behind palace walls, far removed from the events unfolding. On the contrary, she lived side by side with the army, personally inspected warehouses, and monitored the condition of the artillery. In the 1480s, she gave birth to 5 of her 10 children right in the middle of military campaigns. Isabella in 1471, John in 1478, Joanna in 1479, Maria in 1482, and Catherine in 1485. 5 of her children, unfortunately, died in infancy, but those who survived became her most important political assets. Her behavior at Granada in 1491, when she remained in the burning camp, eloquently testified that she was not simply sitting on the throne. The soldiers literally idolized her, and the nobility respected her for her extraordinary courage. Such was her style, to be right where key decisions were made and where everything was decided. In 1492, after the fall of Granada, the Inquisition kicked into high gear. An edict issued on March 31st mandated the expulsion of Jews and Muslims who refused to convert to Christianity. Isabella backed this decision in the name of national unity, though some sources suggest she harbored doubts deep down. One day in August of 1492, she summoned an elderly Jewish doctor to the Alhambra, accusing him of heresy. Under the guise of testing his faith, she ordered him to appear at night. In a secret chamber, adorned with tapestries and lit by candlelight, she questioned him about his remedies, his family, and the reasons for his refusal to be baptized. He told her about the patients he had treated and the children left destitute. Isabella listened intently, her face as impassive as stone. But at the end of their conversation, she gave him a purse of gold and whispered, "Flee to Portugal before I change my mind." He vanished without a trace, and the Queen told no one about it. This isolated incident certainly didn't halt the Inquisition's machinery, but it showed that behind her outward resolve lay a deep humanity, one she was forced to conceal to safeguard her crown. Isabella passed away on November 26, 1504, in Medina del Campo, from an illness believed to be uterine cancer. She was 53. Her reign, spanning from 1474 to 1504, left Spain unified, with vast colonies across the ocean and undisputed glory in Europe. Her daughter Joanna inherited the throne, but Ferdinand effectively ruled due to her developing mental illness, known as madness. Isabella wasn't a blind zealot in royal robes, but rather a visionary investor who made a risky bet on Columbus. She was a brilliant strategist who completed the centuries-long Reconquista, and without a doubt, a public relations genius whose armor outside Granada became a legend, celebrated for ages. She ruled the country not by dogma, but by precise calculation, proving convincingly that the throne is not just a gift of fate, but a carefully calculated wager that can be won with exceptional intelligence and unwavering will. Now, let's jump to 19th century Britain, where Queen Victoria reigned for 63 years and transformed the monarchy into a living symbol of an entire historical era. She didn't gallop on a war horse or throw the royal treasury into dubious ventures, but quietly and steadily held a vast empire in her hands, while other rulers fussed about in futile attempts to consolidate their influence. Her story isn't about resounding military feats, but about how to become an eternal legend, almost without ever leaving the royal chair. Victoria was born on May 24, 1819, within the walls of Kensington Palace, under the perpetually grey London sky. Her mother, Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, was a modest German princess from a small duchy, already widowed with 2 children from her first marriage when she married Edward, Duke of Kent, the 4th son of King George III. Edward desperately wanted an heir to strengthen the Hanoverian dynasty. His elder brothers either had no legitimate children or their offspring were illegitimate. However, he died of pneumonia when Victoria was only 8 months old, leaving his family with huge debts and little hope for the future. Victoria's mother, determined to raise her daughter into an ideal princess and future queen, took all the reins of power into her own hands. Together with Sir John Conroy, her domineering and influential advisor, she developed the so-called Kensington system, a regime of extremely strict control over the princess. No playdates, no dances, just lessons and iron discipline. Victoria slept in her mother's room, ate strictly on schedule, and walked only under the watchful eye of her governess, Louise Lehzen, a German woman with a kind heart but a firm hand. She was taught languages, history, mathematics, music, everything that was necessary for a well-bred lady of royal blood. Her mother and Conroy deliberately kept her away from the corrupt royal court, where her uncles, George IV and William IV, led dissolute lives and failed to produce legitimate heirs. Victoria grew up in the shadows, surrounded by books and strict rules, until fate one day presented her with the crown. Britain in those years was at a historic crossroads. Napoleon had been decisively defeated, but the country was still healing from the deep wounds inflicted by prolonged wars. The Industrial Revolution was gaining momentum. Factory chimneys smoked everywhere, steam engines roared, and cities grew like mushrooms after rain. However, along with progress, inevitably came new challenges: mass poverty, unsanitary conditions, and growing discontent among the population. While the working population suffered from unbearable poverty and the gentry revelled in unprecedented luxury, the monarchy of Great Britain was on the verge of collapse. King George III had succumbed to madness. George IV was famous for numerous scandals, and William IV, an old sailor, died without leaving legitimate heirs. Thus, when William passed away, Victoria, who had just turned 18, ascended the throne and was proclaimed Queen on June 22, 1837. She immediately moved into Buckingham Palace, eager to escape her mother's excessive supervision. Her youth coincided with a period when Parliament was actively taking power away from monarchs, and the people everywhere were demanding radical changes, from the complete abolition of slavery to granting rights to workers. The country was literally seething with internal contradictions, and Victoria found herself at the very center of this historic whirlwind. Her reign, which began on June 22, 1837, lasted 63 years, until January 22, 1901. This era went down in history as the Victorian era. When Victoria ascended the throne, Great Britain was in a very difficult position. Industry, although actively developing, was accompanied by mass strikes by workers, and rebellions flared up from time to time in the colonies. By the end of her reign, the British Empire covered almost half the globe. India, after the Sepoy Mutiny, became the jewel in the crown, and Canada, Australia and South Africa were also under her rule. However, Victoria was not the kind of ruler who would personally interfere in the thick of political events. She came to power at a time when the monarchy had already lost its former absolute power. After the revolutionary upheavals in Europe and numerous reforms in Great Britain itself, kings could no longer rule alone. Parliament and successive prime ministers, such as Lord Melbourne, her good-natured mentor in her youth, Robert Peel with his strict austerity, Benjamin Disraeli with his imperial ambitions, and William Gladstone with his endless debates, took the reins of power. They argued endlessly, drafted laws, resolved crises, while Victoria remained on the sidelines, merely signing documents and observing. She didn't meddle in their internal squabbles, and that was her true strength. While ministers fought for their ideas, she remained above the fray, acting as a symbol of stability and trust, which was crucial for maintaining unity. Britain at this time was actively building railroads, steamboats, factories, expanding its colonial possessions, and Victoria kept everything in balance, almost without interfering. She didn't invent laws, but she had an amazing ability to choose whom to trust, and with a single letter could cool down heads that were too hot. Her personal life added special colors to this unique story. On February 10, 1840, she married Albert, Prince of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, who was her cousin. Albert became her great love, intelligent, active, possessing refined taste and many innovative ideas. They had 9 children. Albert actively participated in their upbringing, instilling in them discipline and a love of learning, and then their children were married to princes and princesses all over Europe, from the Russian Tsarevich to German dukes. Together, they completely rebuilt Buckingham Palace, acquired Osborne House as a refuge from the London bustle, and also organized the famous Great Exhibition with its Crystal Palace, which became a triumph of progress. But on December 14th, 1861, Albert died of typhoid fever, leaving Victoria alone with her children and a vast empire. She mourned him until the end of her days, always wearing black, but she did not break, continuing to rule, maintaining her composure. Her personal diaries are a real treasure trove, numbering 122 volumes. She began writing as a teenager and did not stop until old age. Every day, she left at least a couple of lines about the weather, about meetings, about Albert, about the children. In her youth, she recorded her fears of her mother, her first steps on the throne, her delight at meeting Albert. After his death, the pages darkened. She wrote about the emptiness, about how she missed his advice. But you can also find grumbling about ministers who mess everything up, notes about grandchildren, and even about cold tea or a failed walk. These records open a window into her mind, from a girl afraid of her mother, to a young queen hopelessly in love with her husband, and then to a mature woman holding the empire in check, almost without interfering in day-to-day management. The historical backdrop to her reign was a world transforming at breakneck speed. The Industrial Revolution was propelling Britain forward with relentless force. Coal, steel, steam, all birthing both unprecedented wealth and abject poverty simultaneously. Workers were clamoring for rights. Women began to openly advocate for suffrage, and colonies fought for their freedom. India became an integral part of the empire, yet also a hotbed of uprisings. Victoria witnessed the abolition of slavery, the construction of awe-inspiring bridges and majestic ships, and science, from Darwin's theories to the harnessing of electricity, upending the established order. Yet she herself didn't rush headlong into these changes. Her prime ministers handled the dirty work. Melbourne tutored her in politics, Peel battled famine, Disraeli expanded the empire, and Gladstone championed debates about freedom. Victoria, however, remained a symbol. While the country seethed with change, she was the unshakable anchor, a beacon of calm and composure. Her children and grandchildren forged kinship ties between Britain and the entirety of Europe, and her name became synonymous with an era, the Victorian Age, with all its primness, progress, and paradoxes. Victoria passed away on January 22, 1901, at the age of 81, on the Isle of Wight, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Thus, an epoch came to a close, but the question lingered. Was it a stroke of strategic genius to remain inactive, or an unwitting acknowledgement of the limits of monarchical power? Her unprecedented reign spanned 63 years, commencing on June 22, 1837, and concluding on January 22, 1901. Upon relinquishing the throne to her son, the future King Edward, she bequeathed not just vast territories, but an empire upon which, it seemed, the sun never set. Moreover, under her leadership, the monarchy metamorphosed from a mere institution of power into a potent symbol of order, permanence, and grandeur. Her leadership style eschewed flamboyant gestures or seismic shifts. Instead, she drew strength from her inner reserves, immortalized in her diaries, demonstrating a quiet yet unwavering will and an aptitude for maintaining control as the world around her underwent rapid transformation. She didn't merely bear witness to an era, she, in essence, forged it, leaving Britain in the form we recognize today. Now, whisking ourselves away to Scandinavia, to the 1700s, we encounter a starkly different path chosen by another monarch, Christina of Sweden. She made the bold decision to abdicate her royal duties in favor of a passion for philosophy, retreating to Rome to dedicate herself to patronizing intellectuals and the arts. Christina was born on December 8, 1626, within the majestic royal castle of 3 Crowns in Stockholm, where her arrival was accompanied by the howling of a harsh northern wind. Her father, the celebrated Gustavus Adolphus II, was a true legend of his time, a tall, red-bearded Protestant warrior under whose leadership Sweden reached unprecedented heights during the 30 Years' War. Her mother, Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg, a German princess, was renowned for her captivating beauty, but suffered from profound emotional instability. When Christina first cried, her booming voice led everyone to believe the newborn was a boy. Yet Gustavus, unwavering, joyfully welcomed his daughter, convinced that she would inherit his exceptional intellect. On November 6, 1632, fate dealt a crushing blow. Gustavus perished in the bloody Battle of Lutzen, leaving 6-year-old Christina as the sole heir to the throne. Maria Eleonora descended into an abyss of inconsolable grief. Her despair manifested in eccentric and distressing mourning rituals. She kept her husband's embalmed heart in a jewel-encrusted box and regularly staged emotional outbursts in the palace, which deeply traumatized young Christina. It soon became clear that for the sake of the girl's well-being, she had to be separated from her mother. From that moment on, her upbringing was tailored as if she were the future king. Christina mastered horseback riding, swordsmanship, and even wore men's clothing. By the age of 10, she was fluent in Latin and ancient Greek, demonstrating a profound understanding of history and mathematics. By 15, she could engage in such sharp and reasoned debates with seasoned royal advisors that they were often left bewildered. Her mind was remarkably incisive, and she never intended to be merely a figurehead on the throne. At that time, Sweden was at the epicenter of the 30 Years' War, which had begun in 1618. Europe was plunged into the chaos of religious conflict, with Catholics and Protestants ruthlessly tearing the continent apart, armies marching relentlessly across the lands, and cities reduced to ruins. Gustavus Adolphus II had managed to transform Sweden into a formidable power, but after his death, the country remained under the rule of regents until Christina came of age. Her official coronation took place in 1644, when she turned 18. In the early years of her reign, Christina actively and competently engaged in state affairs, signing decrees, participating in complex diplomatic negotiations, and playing a key role in ending the war with the signing of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. This treaty not only redrew the political map of Europe, but also significantly expanded Swedish territories. However, despite her success in politics, her true aspirations lay elsewhere. She transformed Stockholm into a thriving hub of European thought, inviting eminent scholars and philosophers and hosting lively intellectual debates within the walls of her palace. Her library became her greatest passion. Thousands of volumes, including ancient texts, modern treatises, and the rarest manuscripts, which she meticulously collected throughout Europe, representing a treasury of knowledge. She slept very little, preferring to devote her nights to deep study, and instead of traditional women's dresses, she wore doublets, completely ignoring the disapproval of courtiers who expected a more conventional, queenly demeanor. By the age of 25, Christina had come to the firm conviction that the throne was not a privilege, but rather gilded shackles, restricting her freedom. The Swedish aristocracy persistently demanded that she marry and produce heirs to continue the dynasty. She was offered a wide array of candidates, noble Swedish aristocrats, foreign princes, including her cousin Charles Gustav. However, she rejected all marriage proposals, unwilling to bind herself to vows that contradicted her pursuit of absolute intellectual freedom rather than dynastic alliances. On June 6, 1654, she convened the Riksdag, the Swedish parliament, and announced her abdication. The crown passed to Charles Gustav, whom she fully trusted as a capable and wise ruler. Christina relinquished the throne, gathered only the most essential belongings, and left Sweden forever. This decision shocked everyone. A queen voluntarily renouncing power for the sake of ideas seemed unfathomable. Courtiers were aghast, common folk whispered, and all of Europe buzzed with amazement and bewilderment. But she never doubted the correctness of her choice for a moment. Her path led to Rome, the eternal city of art, philosophy, and intellectual freedom. En route, in 1655, in Innsbruck, she converted to Catholicism, which dealt a severe blow to Protestant Sweden. In Rome, she was greeted with extraordinary honor. Pope Alexander VII personally arranged a grand entrance, and Christina took up residence in the luxurious Palazzo Farnese. There, her residence quickly transformed into a vibrant center of intellectual life, where the most eminent artists, poets, and philosophers of the time gathered. She spent lavishly on acquiring paintings, supporting musicians, expanding her library, and actively sponsoring theaters and scientific academies. Her Roman library grew to colossal proportions, numbering thousands of volumes, from ancient Roman writings to contemporary works by her contemporaries, making her collection one of the most impressive in all of Europe. While still in Sweden, she had invited René Descartes, the greatest philosopher of his era, to be her mentor. He arrived in Stockholm in 1649, but Christina insisted on holding lessons early in the morning in the frigid palace. Unaccustomed to the harsh Swedish cold, Descartes caught a cold and died of pneumonia on February 11, 1650. This tragedy deeply shook Christina, but could not extinguish her unquenchable thirst for knowledge. In Rome, she continued to gather the finest minds of her time around her. Christina passed away on April 19, 1689, in Rome, at the age of 62. She was buried in St. Peter's Basilica, a rare honor for a woman, testifying to her high status and influence. She left behind neither an empire nor a dynasty, but her true legacy was embodied in ideas. Her seeming defeat, this unprecedented renunciation of the throne, was in reality a triumph of reason and freedom of choice. While Charles Gustav waged wars and consolidated Sweden's power, Christina in Rome created an entire universe of thought, actively supporting the arts, tirelessly collecting books, and inspiring scholars to make new discoveries. Although her vast library eventually dispersed into various collections, her name has remained a radiant symbol of freedom from the shackles of power and convention. Thus, we have two queens, each of whom, in her own way, reinterpreted the burden of power and left the world such different yet equally profound imprints of her will. Now, let's turn our gaze to 18th century Austria, where Maria Theresa strides onto the stage of history, a monarch who not only clung to her crown with tooth and nail, but also managed to produce 16 children while fundamentally reshaping her empire, even as the rest of Europe attempted to carve it up. Her life story isn't just a tale of power, it's an inspiring example of how to survive in the face of total opposition, all while maintaining a subtle, almost invisible smile. Maria Theresa was born on May 13, 1717, in the heart of Vienna, within the walls of the opulent Hofburg, where every stone seemed to breathe gold and was steeped in the spirit of intrigue. Her father, Emperor Charles VI, was the last male heir of the Habsburg dynasty, and her mother, Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, was known for her quiet disposition, yet possessed a remarkable resilience. Charles desperately wanted a son and heir, but after the birth of 3 daughters, Maria Theresa was the only one to arrive. Undeterred, he decided that she was destined to handle the burdens of rule. In 1719, he issued the so-called Pragmatic Sanction, a decree that allowed a woman to inherit the throne, defying all traditions. The European powers, at first glance, nodded approvingly and signed the document, but as time would tell, a sly smirk lay hidden behind this agreement. Maria Theresa grew up in a world woven from silk dresses and endless lessons. She studied Latin, learned music and dance, only superficially touching on matters of politics. She was completely unprepared for military challenges, as her father was convinced that the signatures of neighboring monarchs would be quite enough to ensure peace. However, at 23, when Charles VI passed away on October 29, 1740, she bitterly realized that signatures were just paper, and the throne had to be held with gritted teeth. Austria, at that moment, was a fragmented patchwork of lands. The vast Habsburg Empire stretched from Hungary to Italy, from Bohemia to the Netherlands, a rich but extremely weak state. Charles left behind an empty treasury and an army in complete disrepair, and the predatory powers of Europe were already sharpening their knives. No sooner had Maria Theresa placed the crown on her head than the War of the Austrian Succession broke out. Prussia, led by the ambitious Frederick II, France, Bavaria, Saxony, they all came to the conclusion that the young woman would not be able to hold the throne. Frederick boldly seized Silesia, the richest province, abundant in coal and iron, which marked the beginning of large-scale military clashes. In 1741, Maria Theresa, pregnant and completely inexperienced in matters of war, faced a painful choice: to capitulate or to fight. She chose the latter without hesitation. Her first move was truly ingenious. In 1741, she went to Hungary, where the local nobility grumbled and did not want to provide support. And so, the 24-year-old queen appeared before the Hungarian Diet in Pressburg, dressed in men's clothing, a doublet, boots, a hat with a feather, and holding her infant son, the future Joseph, in her arms. She passionately appealed to their honor, dramatically begging for protection, and the Hungarians, deeply touched by this theatrical but sincere performance, provided her with an army. She may have looked a bit funny in a man's hat, but the effect produced was ironclad. The Hungarian regiments became her reliable shield. The war raged on for 8 years, until 1748, when the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle drew a line under it. Maria Theresa lost Silesia, but managed to hold on to all her other possessions: Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, and the Italian lands. Her throne stood firm, and she threw herself into domestic affairs with renewed energy. The empire was in a state of complete chaos. Taxes were collected irregularly, the army was falling apart, and officials were mired in corruption. She decided on a total overhaul. With a touch of irony, one might say that while other kings fought for military glory, Maria Theresa waged her wars against bureaucracy and paperwork. She created a modern, centralized bureaucratic system, introduced uniform taxes, established central government departments, and put officials on a fixed salary, eradicating the practice of bribery. Her astute chancellor, Wenzel Anton Kaunitz, became the brains behind these large-scale reforms, while Maria Theresa herself was their driving heart. The army was rearmed and reorganized, schools were opened to ordinary folks, and medicine was lifted from the shadow of quackery and set on the path of scientific development. By 1760, the empire was no longer teetering under blows, but standing firmly on its feet, all under her watchful eye, even as she continued to bear children, 16 in all. She married Francis Stephen of Lorraine in 1736, and this marriage was one of love, a rarity for that era. Francis was incredibly handsome, but hardly a warrior or statesman. He preferred hunting and card games to running the country. 10 of her 16 children survived, and Maria Theresa turned them into a powerful instrument of power, pursuing what became known as cradle diplomacy. She married them off to kings and dukes across Europe. Marie Antoinette became the wife of Louis XVI in France, Joseph became emperor, and Leopold became Grand Duke of Tuscany. Europe effectively became her family business, although it must be admitted not all of these marriages ended happily, as exemplified by the tragic fate of Marie Antoinette under the guillotine. The historical context of her reign was the flowering of the Age of Enlightenment, when progressive ideas of freedom and reason came into conflict with absolutism. Prussia, under Frederick II, grew like a predator, annexing Silesia and openly challenging the power of the Habsburgs. France, under Louis XV, wove intricate intrigues, and Russia, under Peter III, and then Catherine II, actively expanded its influence to the south and west. The 7 Years' War, lasting from 1756 to 1763, became another severe test. In this conflict, Prussia and Britain opposed Austria, France, and Russia. Maria Theresa, along with her Chancellor Kaunitz, made desperate attempts to regain Silesia, but they failed. Frederick proved too cunning. However, her reforms made the empire extraordinarily stable and viable. By 1770, Austria was not just surviving, but setting the tone in European politics. She passed away on November 29, 1780, in the Hofburg, at the age of 63, leaving the throne to her son Joseph II. Her reign, lasting 40 years, from 1740 to 1780, transformed the empire into a well-oiled machine running like clockwork. Now, let's jump ahead to early 19th century Prussia, where Queen Louise of Prussia, a woman with a fiery heart and an unyielding will, became a true source of inspiration for her people in the fight against Napoleon, transforming into a living symbol of the nation during its greatest humiliation. Louise Augusta Wilhelmina Amalia was born on March 10, 1776, in Hanover, to Duke Charles of Mecklenburg-Strelitz and his wife, Frederica of Hesse-Darmstadt. Her father was a soldier serving in the Hanoverian army under the British Crown, but his position was not particularly wealthy or influential, and the health of her mother, Frederica, was quite frail. Thus, history shows that in the hands of female rulers, the crown can be both a symbol of humility and service and a banner of desperate struggle for survival, but always an inexhaustible source of change. On May 22, 1782, her mother passed away tragically, leaving 6-year-old Louise and her younger sister Frederica as complete orphans. After this irreparable loss, their grandmother, Maria Louise Albertine of Leiningen, known for her strict morals and deep religious convictions, took care of the girls. Louise's childhood was spent in Darmstadt, in the rather modest setting of the ducal court, which stood in stark contrast to the splendor of other European monarchies. There were no lavish celebrations or balls. Her upbringing was focused on lessons, prayers, and instilling a sense of duty. She studied German and French, history and music, but the most important lesson for her was the resilience of spirit and unwavering faith, which later became her main support in life. Contemporaries unanimously noted her striking natural beauty, light, almost golden hair, piercing blue eyes, and an unusually soft voice. However, even then, a distinct firmness of character showed through this delicate appearance. Prussia, in the late 18th century, was experiencing a period of profound decline following the death of Frederick II the Great in 1786. The greatness that had been built on unprecedented military power and visionary reforms began to fade relentlessly. The army became outdated and lost its former effectiveness. The economy weakened, and King Frederick William II, the father of her future husband, was far more consumed with personal pleasures than with strengthening the foundations of the state. In 1793, at the age of 17, Louise, along with her sister Frederica, arrived in Frankfurt, where they were to be presented at court. It was there, at one of the balls, that she first met Crown Prince Frederick William, son of the reigning monarch. He was a tall, reserved man, prone to melancholy and indecision, but her lively disposition and disarming charm instantly won his heart. On December 24, 1793, their wedding took place in the magnificent Charlottenburg Palace in Berlin. 4 years later, on November 16, 1797, after the death of Frederick William II, her husband ascended the throne as Frederick William III, and Louise, accordingly, became Queen of Prussia. Their marriage produced 9 children, 7 of whom lived to adulthood. Louise was a devoted mother to them, but her role in the country's history extended far beyond the family hearth. Europe at this time was being shaken by the unprecedented Napoleonic Wars. The French Revolution of 1789 had irrevocably overturned the established old order, and Napoleon, who had risen rapidly to power in 1799, had managed to transform the prevailing chaos into a powerful empire. By this point, he had already crushed the combined armies of Austria and Russia at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, and Prussia, exhausted and fragmented, was the next target of his conquests. On October 14, 1806, Napoleon's armies inflicted a crushing defeat on the Prussian troops in the decisive battles of Jena and Auerstedt. This defeat was truly catastrophic. In just one day, Prussia lost almost its entire army. Its capital, Berlin, fell on October 27th, and the king, along with Louise, were forced to flee east, first to Königsberg and then to Memel, on the very edge of their kingdom. Napoleon, triumphantly entering Berlin, imposed a heavy contribution on Prussia of 100 million francs, reduced the size of the Prussian army to 42,000 men, and seized half of its territories, including all lands west of the Elbe River. Prussia was under complete French control, humiliated and utterly broken. Frederick William III, characterized by excessive caution bordering on inaction, leaned toward reconciliation with the invader. However, Louise could not and would not accept such a state of affairs. She became an inspiring voice of resistance. Her letters to her husband were full of calls to battle, and her words sustained the spirit of the people. She fearlessly traveled through the ruined cities, personally met with soldiers, comforted the families of the dead and wounded. Her presence and unwavering faith lifted the spirits of the Prussians. Napoleon later, with sarcasm, but also with a certain admiration, called her the only man in Prussia, a remark that vividly reflected her resilience and enormous influence. In July of 1807, Louise undertook a desperate trip to Tilsit to negotiate with Napoleon, seeking to soften the terms of the impending Treaty of Tilsit. Prussia was completely defeated, its lands and resources exhausted, and the king sincerely hoped that the Queen's personal intervention would help to secure at least some concessions. On July 6, 1807, she met with the emperor in a modest room in Tilsit, on the banks of the Niemen River. She was pale, dressed in a simple gown, but she maintained an unyielding dignity. Napoleon, confident in his absolute power, received her politely but pointedly coldly. Louise pleaded to preserve Prussia's lands and its army, trying her best to use her charm and eloquence to influence him. She spoke of Prussia's honor, of its suffering people, but Napoleon remained steadfast. He saw in her a woman who would not give up, and this seemed to unnerve and irritate him. The negotiations lasted for 2 days, until July 9th, when the Treaty of Tilsit was signed, enshrining humiliating conditions for Prussia. The country lost significant territories and remained under complete French influence. Despite all her efforts, the Queen did not succeed in achieving major concessions, but her desperate attempt showed her unwavering determination and willingness to fight for her country, even in the most hopeless situation. Thus, against the backdrop of global upheavals, great women of different eras demonstrated that a crown can become not only a symbol of power, but also a heavy burden, requiring incredible strength of spirit and a willingness to self-sacrifice. The French Emperor, Napoleon, although he admired Josephine's irresistible charm, as he repeatedly wrote to her in his personal letters, nevertheless remained unyielding to her persistent requests, while recognizing her influence and character in his memoirs. Sadly, Queen Louise of Prussia never lived to see the triumphant rebirth of her homeland. In 1809, her health irreversibly declined. She was plagued by an exhausting cough and increasing weakness, clear signs of a serious pulmonary disease, which may have been tuberculosis or a severe form of pneumonia. On July 19, 1810, at the age of only 34, she passed away in the tranquil estate of her grandfather, located in Strelitz, surrounded by her children in her final moments. Her untimely passing plunged all of Prussia into deep mourning. Ordinary people mourned the loss on the streets of the cities. Soldiers made vows of allegiance, promising to continue the cause to which she had devoted herself, and even the usually restrained and imperturbable king was struck by inconsolable grief. The Queen's body was laid to rest in Charlottenburg, where a magnificent mausoleum was later erected in her honor. Just 3 years later, in 1813, Prussia, having regained its resolve, rose up against the power of Napoleon, joining the Sixth Coalition. This uprising was deeply inspired by the far-sighted reforms of Stein and Hardenberg, which, although they began after her death, were imbued with the spirit of national revival. The image of Louise, the queen who did not bow her head in the face of a powerful enemy, became a powerful symbol of this national liberation resistance, greatly strengthening the spirit of the entire nation. After Napoleon's final fall in 1815, Prussia began its rapid recovery, significantly expanding its borders through new lands acquired as a result of the Congress of Vienna. Nevertheless, Louise remained forever in the public memory as the true mother of the nation, whose unyielding steadfastness and personal example became a powerful catalyst and inspirer of the heroic struggle for freedom. And now we turn our gaze to the opposite end of the world, to China in the late 19th century, where Cixi, the last de facto ruling empress of the Qing dynasty, reigned. She ruled a vast empire from behind a mysterious golden screen, like a skilled puppeteer in an ancient shadow play, pulling the invisible strings of young and inexperienced emperors. Cixi, born Yehonala, came into the world on November 29, 1835, in the heart of Beijing, in the modest family of an insignificant Manchu official belonging to the Nala clan. Her origins were rooted in the Manchus, once a nomadic people who, in 1644, managed to conquer China and establish the mighty Qing dynasty, thus establishing themselves as a ruling minority amidst an overwhelming Han majority. Cixi's childhood took place in an atmosphere of this constant ethnic and cultural tension. Her family, although belonging to the Manchu elite, did not possess significant wealth, and her father, Hui Zheng, served in the provinces for a long time before receiving an appointment to the capital. Very little reliable information has been preserved about her early years. In 1851, when she was 16 years old, Cixi, like hundreds of other Manchu girls, was summoned to the Forbidden City, a colossal palace complex where the Xianfeng Emperor personally selected his concubines. She entered the imperial harem of the fifth rank, which was the lowest step in a complex hierarchy where survival and promotion depended solely on luck, natural beauty, and sophisticated cunning. The Forbidden City was a true labyrinth, full of palace intrigues and secret conspiracies. Thousands of women desperately fought for the slightest attention from the emperor, and it was in this ruthless struggle that Cixi, displaying extraordinary intelligence and an iron will, began her rapid ascent. In 1856, she gave birth to a son, Zaichun, who turned out to be the Xianfeng Emperor's only heir. This event instantly elevated her status to concubine of the second rank, and she was given the title Lan Guifei, which translated to precious orchid. The birth of an heir became her key to the highest spheres of power. When the Xianfeng Emperor passed away on August 22, 1861, at his summer residence in Chengde, leaving the 5-year-old Zaichun on the throne, Cixi did not passively await the grace of fate. The dying emperor appointed 8 influential Manchu princes as regents to govern the country on behalf of the young monarch, but Cixi immediately saw them as a direct threat to her ambitions. Then Cixi, together with the Dowager Empress Zhen and Prince Gong, the half-brother of the late Xianfeng emperor, organized a cunning conspiracy that went down in history as the Xinyu coup. In November of the same year, 1861, immediately upon returning to Beijing from the emperor's funeral, they began a decisive struggle for the throne. The regents were immediately arrested. 3 of them, Su Xun, Duanhua and Zayuan, were executed, and the rest were exiled. After a successful coup, Cixi acquired the title of Empress Dowager, dubbed Compassionate and Joyful, while Zhen became known as Compassionate and Sacred. From then on, Cixi governed the empire quite literally from behind the scenes, specifically from behind a yellow silk screen. From there, she dictated edicts to her young son, the Tongzhi Emperor, as he sat on the throne. Her reign was akin to a puppet show, where the young emperors played their assigned roles while she invisibly pulled all the strings of power. The Tongzhi Emperor grew up weak and capricious, while Cixi and Zhen exercised actual control of the country through court officials. When Tongzhi died on January 12, 1875, at the age of 19, the official cause of death was smallpox, though whispers of syphilis or the consequences of a dissolute lifestyle circulated among the people. Cixi didn't flinch. Breaking centuries of tradition regarding succession, she chose her 4-year-old nephew, Zaixian, the son of her own sister and Prince Chun, and placed him on the throne as the Guangxu Emperor on February 25, 1875. By then, the Empress Dowager Zhen had passed away, leaving Cixi as the sole ruling Empress Dowager, continuing to govern from behind the screen. Her power was further consolidated, but the political scene grew more complicated each day. China was quite literally coming apart at the seams under the mounting pressure from Western powers and internal upheavals. China, in the late 19th century, was on the verge of complete collapse. The Opium Wars, the first lasting from 1839 to 1842 and the second from 1856 to 1860, had left the empire humiliated and weakened. Great Britain, France, and other European powers imposed crippling, unequal treaties on China, forcing it to open its ports to international trade. Hong Kong was ceded to the British, and in 1860, Western forces demonstratively burned down the old summer palace in Beijing, leaving behind only smoking ruins as a grim warning. Cixi saw these barbarians as a direct threat to her throne and the power of the Manchu dynasty. Her domestic policy was deeply steeped in extreme conservatism. She clung fanatically to the established Confucian order, ancient rituals, and age-old customs, adamantly rejecting any reforms that might have modernized China and strengthened it in the face of external threats. She loathed everything Western: railroads, steamships, new ideas, anything that, in her view, could shake her familiar world and traditional foundations. However, it was precisely this unwavering conservatism that became her most fateful mistake. A telling example is the fate of the Summer Palace, a symbol of her rule. In 1888, Cixi ordered its restoration, spending a colossal sum of 22 million silver taels on it. This sum was, in effect, diverted from funds intended to modernize the Beiyang fleet, the most important naval force that was supposed to protect China from a rising Japan. What price would such a choice exact on the future of the Middle Kingdom? While the state treasury dwindled rapidly, she continued to build exquisite gardens, majestic pavilions, and, most notably, ordered the construction of a marble boat on the waters of Kunming Lake, a stationary decoration that became a symbolic mockery of the real warships so necessary to defend the country. In 1894, the First Sino-Japanese War broke out, resulting in the complete defeat of the Beiyang fleet. Japan seized the island of Taiwan and the Liaodong Peninsula, definitively crushing Chinese naval power. Cixi, as if in a tragic play, gazed upon her luxurious palace, the cost of which exceeded that of an entire fleet, while the empire lost its territories and rapidly forfeited its dignity on the world stage. Her unrestrained penchant for luxury and stubborn unwillingness to accept necessary changes turned into an act of tragic theatre. She continued to play the role of a great ruler, while the country relentlessly spiraled into the abyss of decline. When, in June of 1898, the Guangxu Emperor, inspired by the ideas of Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao, initiated the so-called 100 Days Reform, Cixi instantly felt a direct threat to her influence. The young emperor strived for modernization, the construction of railroads, the opening of new schools, the creation of an army modeled on the West, everything that Cixi loathed with all her heart. On September 21st, 1898, she struck back. The coup, supported by General Yuan Shikai, led to the overthrow of Guangxu. He was imprisoned on Yingtai Island in the Forbidden City. 6 prominent reformers were executed, and Kang and Liang managed to flee the country. Cixi returned to the fullness of power, ruling the empire directly through her ministers. In 1900, the Boxer Rebellion provided her with an opportunity. Cixi supported the anti-Western rebels, cherishing the hope of expelling all foreigners from China. However, in August of that same year, 1900, the combined forces of the 8-nation alliance, Great Britain, France, the United States of America, Russia, Japan, Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, entered Beijing, utterly defeating the Boxers. Cixi fled to Xi'an with Guangxu, disguised as a simple peasant woman, a scene worthy of the most dramatic production. Returning in 1902, she announced the start of long-overdue reforms, the creation of new schools, the reorganization of the army, the abolition of traditional exams for officials. However, these measures proved too late and too insignificant to save the empire. Cixi died on November 15, 1908, in the Forbidden City, at the age of 72, just one day after the death of the Guangxu Emperor. Rumors persisted that he was poisoned on her personal orders in order to prevent his possible return to power after her demise. She was buried in the Eastern Qing tombs, in a grandiose mausoleum that she had been building for 12 years, adorning it with gold and jade, everything that fully corresponded to her immoderate ambitions. Her reign lasted almost half a century, from 1861 to 1908, and left China in a state of deep ruin. In 1911, the Xinhai Revolution swept away the Qing dynasty, and the last emperor, Puyi, abdicated the throne in 1912. The paradox of her fate lies in the fact that it was precisely her conservatism, her desperate clinging to outdated traditions and orders, that paradoxically accelerated the collapse of the dynasty. She sincerely wished to save the Qing, but her irrational fear of any change opened the way for a destructive revolution. Cixi remained in history as a legendary figure, a great actress on a grand stage, both cunning and luxurious, but ultimately a tragic figure. Napoleon Bonaparte once aptly called China a sleeping dragon. Cixi certainly woke it up, but this process did not happen quite as she had dreamed. We began our narrative with Louise of Prussia, whose image became an inspiration for Prussia in the fight against Napoleon, and concluded it with the story of Cixi, the last empress of China, who ruled the country from behind the backs of puppet emperors. Before them and after, history knew other outstanding female rulers: Hurrem Sultan, Isabella of Castile, Victoria of Great Britain, Christina of Sweden, and Maria Theresa of Austria. Each of them left her unique mark on history. Hurrem Sultan fought her way to the top of power. Isabella of Castile strengthened Spain to unprecedented levels. Victoria transformed Britain into the greatest empire. Christina of Sweden preferred books to the crown. Maria Theresa saved her empire from collapse. Louise gave hope to her people, and Cixi desperately clung to the past. They fought for their ideals and their states in different ways, but each of them demonstrated to the world an exceptional strength of spirit and will. Their stories, intertwined through centuries and continents, clearly show one undeniable truth: a single woman is capable of changing the course of an entire era.